Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Simply Trade podcast news roundup today. I am back. I'm your host, Anik, and let's just go over quickly what is happening this week. By the way, Lalo did a great job last week filling in for me. I was having a great time with my friends in New York, so it's always great to be in New York. But I'm back now, and here we are talking a little bit about what's going on this week. So our biggest news, which we will be talking about today, and I will introduce my guest in just a second, are the double downs on steel and aluminum tariffs, which, yeah, we'll talk more. Canada and EU and Mexico retaliation, which we don't really know what that'll be yet, but they definitely have been in the talks, but we see things changing all the time. So we'll have to just look out for that. China announcing new tech export controls. So look into that. USMCA dispute panel ruling. We'll see a change in USMCA, I think, for the next year, but I think they're already talking about that. We'll have an episode on that coming soon. So that's kind of an overview of what's going on. Let me get into the good stuff because I have a special guest and I've been trying to get him on for a long time, but he's busy. I have George Tuttle, which he's been in the industry. Okay, I looked at it. Maybe it's not correct, but it was 35 years of practice.
No, that's really old, by the way.
I thought.
So
okay, it's way longer than that.
I started practicing in 1984.
Okay.
So that's
not 34. You could have just gone along with it.
Yeah. I'm kind of proud of that longevity. That maybe says a lot about me. And not that I'm a tenacious worker, but that I just don't know when to quit.
You know what? And that's fine. If it's something you love, I think you can do it forever. And, I see you at all the trade shows and you'll actually be at GTAC, which we will be at GTAC. So that's great. I know you're speaking. Remind me of what topic?
I'm a partner in a program on related party transfer pricing and use of first sale.
Wow. So, okay. Yeah. Well, look out for that session.
It's really an area that brokers, for the most part, really need to understand, even if they don't directly advise on it.
Yeah. Well, if you're in Oklahoma City, you'll have to stop by, right? If you're listening right now. All right. Well, I brought you on today for an exciting topic, which is
it's
steel
a topping, all right.
Steel and aluminum. Yeah, topping it off with 25% more of tariffs, right? On additional to the 25%. So can you give us an overview what the change is really here?
I kind of went through, and there's an awful lot to digest. And so I, along with all of you out there, are really struggling to digest what all of this means in a 48-hour period. As well as get the stuff done that we need to get done. But I did go through, I've got some resources for everybody if you're not aware of them that will be very helpful for you and maybe getting an idea or an understanding. I also went through and I made some notes, but I picked out what I kind of think are the top 6 or so things you need to know about these new steel and aluminum tariffs. So kind of let's top it all. Let's get started on it, I guess.
Yeah. Let us know.
The most obvious, I think, is first, as of June 4th, the duty on certain steel and aluminum products and products that are made using steel and aluminum, what we call derivative products. That duty, that special trade remedy duty, went up from 25% to 50% for all countries, unless it's the UK, which we now have a trade deal with them. So the tariff rate remains at the steel and aluminum tariff rate remains at 25%, and Russia, which remains at 200%. We don't normally talk about Russia steel and aluminum because everybody says, I'm not buying Russian steel and aluminum. But the problem is if you're buying steel and aluminum from third countries, maybe it's the EU, maybe it's the Middle East. the question is there primary source poor and aluminum and steel raw materials that was produced in Russia? So you really have to get your melt and pour certificates and really understand where the source of that product is coming from.
Yeah, because I know that's what I researched. About half of all aluminum used in the US is imported. So, I mean, there's going to be a problem for all these companies that are importing, right? Because, I mean, were we ever at 50% for steel and aluminum tariffs, or has it always been at 25%?
Well, I mean, it's been incrementally bouncing around, but for the section, and it's important to understand which trade remedy we're talking about, right? Because it can. You have the original 301 tariffs that were put in effect in what we'll call Trump 1 and carried forward in the Biden administration. And the Biden administration increased steel and aluminum tariffs from the original 25% under the original Trump tariff, right? So you have to, it's hierarchical, but you need to understand about and have a game plan and really understand that the original 301 tariffs have never gone away. So that's your basic building block is your 301 to the original 301 tariffs. You always have to ask yourself, am I subject to original 301 tariffs? And then you start looking at the trade remedies tariffs, such as the 232 steel and things like that. We'll get into that as we move down my list of things you really need to understand. So we kind of got lost on where we were going. But again, I was just pointing out that you need to deal with these melt and pour certificates. If you don't have them, you're going to be in real problems when you try to declare an import. And so people struggle with getting those. I think it's getting better as suppliers understand that they need to have those. They need to have that information. And sometimes there's multiple melt and pour operations going on, at least an initial one and a subsequent one. So there's 1 and 2, and you have to deal with those. So there's quite a bit. That's a whole maybe different topic of conversation that we need to deal with. So the next thing that I think I want to talk about, is once you understand the documentation you need to get in order to support your country of origin for your steel or aluminum materials from a melt and pour point of view, is there are changes to the derivatives list. So for both the steel and aluminum tariffs, there's what we call the primary, slabs, ingots, bars, rods, things like that, right? That's clearly within it. But then we start moving into the downstream products, profiles, shapes, things like that, wire, rod, that is beyond that really move into other tariff classifications. And these are downstream products. And then we have the true derivative products. Those are products that are made using the primary source, and they are identified specifically by HTS number. They can be a product that's like a door frame or aluminum wall studs or sheet aluminum that is stamped and fabricated. All of these are derivative products that are most likely subject to these additional 232 tariffs, as well as steel and aluminum components that you put into an article that is not primarily steel and aluminum. And how do we know that? Well, we have to look at the executive order and what we call the annexes to that executive order. And there's 3 or 4 or more annexes that identify by tariff item number those derivative products, those primary and derivative products that are subject to these tariffs. as we get an update to the harmonized tariff schedule, we'll find in Chapter 99 the section notes that also include the annexes. But for right now, you have to rely on customs publication of the annexes, and you have to rely on the most current annexes published. So let me just bring you back to a couple of resources that everyone needs to be aware of. So these are called CSMS messages, and they are messages that are issued by customs that provide additional detailed guidance on how to apply these tariffs. So I would call out to you these CSMS messages that you need to be aware of, and there's basically 3 of them that were all issued with the last couple of days. So this would be 65, 23, 66, 45. That's the first one. And you can easily, research I was going to say Google these, but I guess we still have a trademark on that. And the next one is 65, 23, 63, 74. And then the final one that I would refer you to is 65, 23, 65, 74. So you have to look at all 3 of these, and these will really help you understand how and provide guidance on how to apply these new or revised Section 232
I have a quick question. Sorry. So you know how this is implemented now, and it is kind of a fast pace for companies. They're operating like it's just continuous operations for them. And if it changes like this, do you see a lot of claims happening because company can't follow these instructions like from one day to the next? Like, how will they do that? I mean, that's a little scary.
It is incredibly scary, and everybody is struggling, and the C-suite and the D-suite are all looking to you, the customs broker, or to you, the customs manager or logistics director or whatever, to understand these things overnight. And there's really a tremendous amount of pressure. In terms of claims made, this is not exactly the same as the litigation that many of you have probably heard about regarding the IEEPA duties. The president clearly has authority to levy and to change Section 232 and 301 duties. The recent case law has clearly evidenced that. He might make some mistake in the process, but he clearly has that ability to do that. The IEEPA duties are a little bit different. So I'm not, there are provisions that have changed as you go through this, and you need to be careful of it. There's a section that does allow for protests if the rules have changed, and Customs has clearly said in its CSMS messages about because we've changed the order and the application of stacking, that is the number of tariff provisions that you may be subject to, you can file a protest. But you have to figure out if you've got a protest-worthy matter that you can file on. So again, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that you need to go to these annexes wherever they are, and we provide them to you. If you don't have it, you can ask me by email, and we can provide you with those annexes because you have to carefully now, again, look at all your products, compare it to the annex, and see if you fall within any of these new rules. Obviously, you need to be very familiar with your product to understand, if it's a derivative product, do I include any steel or aluminum content in there? And then you get into this whole discussion about how do you determine the value of your steel or aluminum content. So that's a whole topic in itself, right? And so for that, I would point anybody that's interested in understanding that Customs has developed a very good website on trade remedies. So again, you can Google CBP Trade Remedies website, and it will take you to that, and you'll find all the different trade remedies there, all the resources, the executive orders, the guidance documents. And there's a whole section on frequently asked questions within that website that may provide a lot of answers. I know there was a lot of discussion about the in-transit exemption. What does that mean? How do we interpret it? How do we apply it? So there's some good guidance there. I don't necessarily agree with customs interpretation, or I don't like their interpretation, I should rather say, particularly when we talk about the final mode of transport by vessel. And customs has clearly said, well, a vessel's a boat, it's not a train. So, if your goods are unloaded in Vancouver or Prince Rupert and they go by train to Chicago or somewhere through an inland destination, that train trip doesn't count, right? So there's a lot of surprises in there. But within those frequently asked questions, it tells you what customs expects. If you're doing derivatives, and this is another important change where customs has said that the steel and aluminum duties for derivative products will apply only to the value of the steel or aluminum used in the derivative product. And so in that case, you have to understand how to calculate that steel or aluminum derivative. And customs has said it will be based on the price that the vendor purchased that material for in order to incorporate it into the end product. And if you don't know that value, or if they're not going to tell you that value, if it's unknown, then you have to use the whole value of the article. So we could go on and talk about this a little more, or if you have questions, but I want to keep it moving. But I do encourage you to look at the frequently asked questions where they talk about this. I also want to point out that customs made it clear in their guidance, if your end product includes both steel and aluminum components, then it's going to be subject to both, and you have to break out both of those items. And this is also a change, and an important change, in that for the non-steel or aluminum value in your derivative products, those products will now be subject to the 10% reciprocal tariffs.
Oh, so that is on top of the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Right. That's right. So before, customs made it clear on its website that if it was subject to the 232, then it wasn't subject to the steel and aluminum. These the new rules and the new guidance documents makes it clear that for the non-steel and aluminum component value in the end item will be subject to the reciprocal tariffs.
Are you talking about the stacking and unstacking tariffs here?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you want to know more about that, I have to pull up my guidance document here. The decision tree on the application of the stacking tariffs, what applies and what doesn't, as well as the statement regarding compounded products and the value of the non-aluminum, is in CSMS message 6523 6574. So you can look that up. You can verify my source, but that's the way it's printed out here, right?
Yeah. No.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is a whole topic in itself. The stacking and unstacking. That's
and again, I mean, this CMS message lays it out, and that of course was item 5 and 6 on my list of things. So derivative products with both steel and aluminum can be subject to both tariffs based on the content. The next is that the non-steel and aluminum content is going to be subject to the reciprocal tariffs. Again, you want to make sure that you've got a product that's subject to the derivative steel and aluminum tariffs based on the annexes. So again, you got to get back to those annexes, make sure your product's covered. If it's not on that list, you're at least not subject to this. You may be subject to something else. Then we go into this decision tree analysis that I was talking about with a new priority order of application. So again, this is important to understand. If you're a broker, you're doing your own entries, how do you apply these? There's a very strict hierarchy that you have to apply, and these instructions are provided in these CSMS messages. And of course, as a broker, you're probably, you have to program in all of these new tariff numbers. And there's of these Chapter 99 tariff numbers. And it's a mess because and each circumstance involves a different Chapter 99 tariff number. So you have to get your tariff numbers right.
But at least, I feel like this is not a great outlook, but we already had 25%, right? So this sounds terrible. All they have to do is just add 25%. It's not like a new tariff.
No, that's not true. That is not true. The tariff numbers are different. And so you have to match them up. Don't just assume that you're boosting your tariff duty rate from 25 to 50% and using the same tariff number. That is not necessarily true. And so I want to make that clear, right?
Thank you. I
You
hope
look
no one
at these
is
new
doing that.
tariff numbers and it's a mess. I mean, so there's, and there's very little time for programming going on. I'm sure these programmers that are taking care of all this ACE and systems for brokers and importers, they're staying up all night trying to reprogram and figure this stuff out. So the first thing that on the hierarchy of order that you need to understand is the Section 232 tariffs come second. The first is if you're trying to analyze what's going on. The first thing, the guidance messages tell us that we first look to autos and auto parts. If our product is subject to auto parts, that tariffs, then they're not subject to the 232 tariffs. Okay, so you need to kind of map this out, or they're not subject to the IEEPA tariffs. Now, if it's not subject, if it is subject to auto parts, then it's not subject to 232 and IEEPA. If it's not subject to the auto parts tariffs, then it is going to be subject to the 232. And so then you look to your derivative products, and if it has both, then you're going to have to account for both. You have to account for the non-steel or aluminum value, and you report those under the reciprocal tariffs. So you also need to keep in mind that articles that are subject to other trade remedies. Remember, I talked about in the beginning, this gets back to your stacking. It can be subject to the original 232 tariffs, right? And the updated ones. It's not just 25. I mean, we had a whole host of changes that the Biden administration implemented for Section 301, the original 301 tariffs. And then we had things like the Chinese, the IEEPA tariffs that are currently at 10%. Those tariffs, that was only a 90-day implementation period at the 10%. What's going to happen? Is that going to go up? We have some things that are happening this summer where some of these lower reciprocal tariffs, for instance, the 10% on the countries in the Annex 1 countries, where those tariff rates may go zooming back up.
Okay. But you know what? We're still under investigation too, if these will even stay, right? Completely. Because you know how a lot of people filed for, in courts, filed for them to be not correct, or the IEEPA tariffs that.
So I appreciate that. And again, the IEEPA tariffs could be a whole nother discussion. These are Section 232 tariffs. And just a bit about the court case, because a lot of people ask about that. There are actually 3 court cases. we've heard a lot about too. California sued the federal government in district court here in the Northern District of California as the third suit. And the court held that the tariffs were illegal, but that the court had jurisdiction. And the issue here is that now that's going to go up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So we have two cases in Washington, D.C., one before the Court of International Trade that concluded it was illegal and issued a permanent injunction. And then we have a district court that said, no, we have jurisdiction, Court of International Trade, you don't. We also hold that it's illegal. So you have three court cases that all held that this was an illegal use of presidential power, but all three courts are saying that we have jurisdiction, right? And so, this is interesting because all of these cases are now going up to the appeals court level, and we could get different results depending on that. And then that's just another reason why this is ultimately going to go to the Supreme Court to be decided. And whether it's going to be fast-tracked or not, we don't know. But for right now, people should assume that these tariffs are in place and Customs is going to be collecting them. I think that as a bottom line until this gets to the Supreme Court and a decision is made, because the government is going to say that it's going to suffer irreparable damage if we stay the application of these duties, because people will continue to import and then the government will struggle to try to collect those duties if they ultimately lose, because people won't have the money to pay them. So that's the theory behind the government. And the government says it's not going to be irreparable harm to the importers, because if we lose, court, judge, you can always order the refund of these duties. And I just want to remind everybody that we still have the original 301 case that's before the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit it's been sitting there for 2 years and they haven't issued a decision on it yet. So maybe that will come soon. But again, that's billions of dollars. If the government loses that, the government is going to be bankrupt with the amount of where we are with the deficit, and if the government is forced to refund all those duties. So it's going to be an interesting summer. Watch your court here kind of thing.
Yeah. That is very interesting. Yeah, I've been hearing a lot. I mean, there's so much going on in the news. Obviously, this week, steel and aluminum was the main focus, which we kind of cleared up. I think you cleared that up pretty nicely for people to listen to.
Well, I think it's still confusing, but, again, you have to think through this and begin to draw a little schematic. Is it subject to this? If no, is it subject to this? If no. And then what about these other tariffs? So that's kind of the way you have to approach it. And we'll be having more guidance, more talks as the time rolls out. I'm doing a program on the 17th locally here in the Bay Area for PAEI on the subject. So there's going to be a lot more talking about how to apply this.
Yeah. And I think things change within days here. So, we focus on one thing and people establish this new concept of how they're going to, do these tariffs, like how I just said, you just have to double it. They really don't. They have to do this entire process. And then they go back to their old process because it's getting returned and overturned. And, it's difficult right now. And I feel bad for most of the people in trade right now, but you know what? We're getting through it. And I think the community-based aspect of trade, of our industry is so nice because people can connect, people can ask questions. And then there's obviously these trade shows, where there's you as lawyers who can help out a little bit. So, well, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate that.
I know you had a lot more questions, so I'm sorry if we didn't get to them.
I think, you know what? I was just letting you talk because I have the questions, but my questions are not as good as your information, I think. Because you work with it every day. So whatever whatever you tell me here, I know it's from a place of people asking you, or what do you hear outside, and I think I'm less connected than you are. So I'm very thankful for that. And we'll stay in touch to see what is happening. And and also I just want to plug, we have we have a webinar coming up with Cindy Allen. It's like a mini course, and it's trade action strategies, and it goes over these tariffs and stuff. And she's kind of going, I call her the Taylor Swift of trade, but which that's an awesome title to have, I feel like. And she'll go over all of these things to kind of letting people know on how to address these situations and changes and whatnot. So again, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you coming on and discussing this topic with me. And I hope you have a great week, and we'll be back next Monday, and it'll be a European episode. So looking forward to that, because
that'll be very interesting.
Yeah, there's lots happening in the EU. So I have someone from France coming on, which will be fun. So Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.